In eastern Siberia, where thermometers reach -50 degrees Celsius and the air feels like it cuts the skin like a blade, there is a village that few believe is actually inhabited. In Oymyakon, the cold is not a season. It is a constant state, a presence, that defines even the simplest gesture. And there, between frozen valleys and roads that vanish beneath the snow, lives someone who has learned to call this place home. He wakes before the light, not because he wants to, but because the sun takes too long to rise. Outside, the window is covered by a layer of ice so thick that it would need to be carved through to see the other side. Inside the wooden house, everything creaks, the bed, the floorboards, even the silence. But he doesn't complain. He's learned that living there requires silence before strength. There's no rush in Oymyakon. Every movement is planned with almost surgical precision, because any mistake, any distraction, can come at a high cost. The wind that passes through the crack in the door can freeze a hand within minutes. Even so, there is beauty in slow gestures. Like someone dancing slowly not to wake the monster of cold. The kettle takes 20 minutes to boil. But he waits, sitting at the table, his hands wrapped in thick gloves. There is no hurry at breakfast, because each hot sip is a reminder that he survived another night. The firewood that feeds the stove was chopped during summer, stacked with the care of someone who knows that the future depends on that effort. Each log represents a choice he made to stay when so many had already left. And that's why, when placing the first one into the fire, he closes his eyes and listens to the crackle with reverence. There's not much in the fridge, but there's no waste either. The fish was caught before the lake froze, and the bread was baked in the community oven. Sharing is an unwritten rule there, because in such extreme places, surviving alone is an illusion. It is in silent sharing that the community recognizes itself as a tribe. He opens the door, and the vapor from the indoor warmth clashes with the outside air, creating a white mist as if the house itself were breathing with him. He pulls on his heavy boots, covers his face, and heads out for another day. The eyes are the only exposed part of the body. And even so, they've learned to withstand the wind. The village school is just a few minutes walk away, but there, minutes can feel like a polar crossing. He's no longer a child, but he still remembers when the route was a game of endurance, and how some friends left Oymyakon with promises of an easier world. The difference is that he stayed, and not out of stubbornness, but because there's something about living in a place that everyone avoids, a kind of dignity that can't be explained. There's no fame, no luxury, but there is purpose, and that, he's learned, can't be bought. With modern heaters, he works as a technician at the small local power station. The generator requires constant maintenance. And there, surrounded by machines, cables, and circuits, he feels that he has a mission. Keeping everything running is more than a job. It's keeping the village's heart beating in the dark. Sound of the motor contrasts with the absolute silence of the snow outside. The sound echoes as if even the pine trees were listening. And in a way, that makes him feel less alone. As if everything around him were also trying to withstand the same cold he does. There are days when he wonders why he's still there. When the wind howls like an animal trapped between the mountains. When his fingers don't respond. When his face burns from so much ice. But it's precisely on those days that something inside him awakens. A kind of quiet pride, because those who live in Oymyakon learn to see beauty where no one else would. In the moon's reflection on the frozen river. In the sound of ice cracking underfoot. In the scent of skin after hours by the fire. Small things that only exist when everything is extreme. Sometimes, someone from the big city arrives to film. They want to see what life is like in the coldest place on Earth. They bring drones, cameras, and questions. But they don't stay long. They soon leave with pretty images but without understanding what really happens there. Because it's not the cold that hurts the most. It's the silence it brings. A silence that makes everything feel more intense. Every memory echoes louder. Every absence weighs more. And every smile, when it happens, feels rarer and more valuable. He remembers his grandmother, who used to say that the cold reveals people's character. Those who pretend can't endure. Those who run get lost. Those who are strong stay. And that's why, even without saying anything, he feels proud of who he has become. On Sundays, there's a gathering in the village's small meeting house. It's not a formal church, but it's where they share stories, news, and contained laughter. Sitting on old benches, they warm each other. The cold of the body lessens when the soul is accompanied. He rarely says much. But when someone new arrives, he's the one who offers tea first. And he's also the one who helps clear the snow from the entrance. Without saying a word, he shows that surviving there depends on invisible bonds, made of respect, time, and simplicity. At night, the village is a map of small lights in the middle of nowhere. From the outside, everything looks deserted. But inside each house, silent stories are being written. People living with little, but feeling deeply. He looks out the window before sleeping. The snow keeps falling, the wind keeps blowing. But inside him, something remains unmoved. The certainty that the cold outside will never be stronger than what he has already overcome within. That's where the true temperature of life resides. Not in frozen thermometers, but in the choices he makes every day, to stay, to rise, to help, to feel. Those who live in Oymyakon don't seek fame, they seek meaning. And that meaning is sometimes only revealed when everything around you seems frozen. It's when the whole world slows down that the soul hears its own voice. And those who listen remain. And those who remain turn the cold into shelter. That's how he learned to live, not in spite of the cold, but with it. And with each new day, he rediscovers that the truest warmth doesn't come from fire, but from within. That morning, he woke up to the sound of his own breathing. The ceiling was covered by a thin layer of frost, as if the house itself also needed to catch its breath to survive the night that had passed. The alarm clock didn't go off. It didn't need to. The body already knew the time, like someone who learns to dance with nature even without hearing the music. He stretched his arm out from under the covers, and the impact of the freezing air made him pull back. That wasn't just discomfort, it was a daily choice. To leave the warm shelter of the bed and face a world where even the vapor of one's own breath freezes in the air. But he got up, as always, because living there demands more than strength. It demands a kind of silent surrender. He dressed in layers. Thick socks, thermal underwear, thermal shirt, sweater, coat. Each piece was like armor. And still, the cold managed to slip through the cracks and reach him. He had learned to live with it. The cold never goes away. It just learns to walk alongside you. In the kitchen, he lit the fire with the precision of someone who has repeated that gesture since childhood. He placed the kettle on the wood stove and waited. The water took its time to heat, as always. Meanwhile, he watched for the first signs of morning. No birds, no sound. Just the pale light trying to overcome the darkness of the Siberian sky. Sitting at the table, he thought about the day's tasks. He needed to check the generators, help the neighbor with the fence, and if time allowed, visit the elderly lady who lived alone near the trail. But he knew not everything would go as planned. In Oymyakon, time has a will of its own, and the day changes with the wind. The first sip of tea burned his lips. But that was what he wanted, to feel, to confirm that he was still alive, that warmth still existed somewhere. Outside, the door creaked as if something wanted to come in. Maybe it was just the wind. Or maybe it was winter itself, asking for entry. Before leaving, he took a deep breath. Looked around the house. There was no luxury, no modernity. But there was history in every object. The blanket made by his grandmother, the faded photo of his father above the stove, the old radio that still worked. It was a simple house, but full of survival. When he opened the door, the world outside looked like another planet. The freezing air sliced in like a blade. His eyelashes froze in seconds. The snow piled on the ground crackled under his feet like crushed glass. Even with all the preparation, the cold was aggressive. But he didn't hesitate. Because he had learned to respect, not to fight, the climate. He crossed the yard, clearing the accumulated snow that covered the entrance to the small tool shed. Every gesture was slow. Every movement calculated. Because in places like this, the body doesn't forgive excess. And nature doesn't give second chances. On the way to the power station, he passed other houses, some with smoke rising from the chimney, others in absolute silence. But in all of them, there was life. A life that doesn't show itself with noise, but with persistence. A life that doesn't display itself, but that endures. When he arrived at the station, he greeted the colleague finishing the night shift with a nod. Few words were exchanged. The look was enough. In Oymyakon, silence is a language. And those who learn to listen to the unspoken hear everything. For hours, he monitored levels, adjusted valves, replaced parts that had been crying for help for days. The thick gloves made movement difficult, but taking them off would be too risky. Even so, the work was done with precision. Because there, every mistake can cost energy for an entire community. During the break, he sat near the main motor, where the heat was stronger. He took off his gloves for a few minutes and felt the tingling in his fingertips. It was both relief and warning. The body was grateful, but also demanded caution. Because in Oymyakon, the body is the best kind of clock. It always warns when it's time to stop. Before leaving, he left notes with instructions for the next technician. Each annotation carried more than instructions, it carried care. A kind of solidarity among those who keep the village standing. Even when everything around seems to collapse in white. On the way back, he stopped to help his neighbor. The fence had collapsed under the weight of the snow. They worked together for over an hour, in silence. Only the sound of tools and boots sinking in the snow. In the end, the neighbor thanked him with a simple gesture, offered a piece of dried fish and a modest smile. In places like this, generosity is action, not speech. Later, he walked to the trail where the elderly lady lived. He carried a bottle of tea and some biscuits. When he arrived, he found the door slightly ajar. She was sitting near the fireplace. Wrapped in blankets, they talked for a few minutes. She spoke slowly. He listened with respect. And for a moment, the cold seemed to have left the room. On the way back home, the sky was already darkening. And with it, the cold grew even denser. But something in him felt lighter. Maybe it was the feeling of a duty fulfilled. Or maybe it was just the certainty that day, he had been useful to someone. And that, even in the coldest place in the world, is a way to stay warm. At home, he lit the fire again, put water on for a bath. There was no shower, just a basin and thick towels. But that routine, though harsh, carried a dignity he wouldn't trade for empty conveniences. During dinner, he heard on the radio a distant news report about a snowstorm in another part of Siberia. And he thought about how, for the rest of the world, the cold is news, but for him, it's routine. It's landscape. It's teacher. Before sleeping, he wrote a few lines in an old notebook. It wasn't a diary. It was a record of thoughts. Things he didn't want to forget. Sensations, reflections, small victories. Like someone who knows that remembering is also a form of resistance. Then, he turned off the light and lay down. Silence filled everything. But inside him, there was movement. There was memory. There was the echo of a day lived with intention, courage, and a peace that can only be found when the outside world stops demanding and starts teaching. In the dark, he closed his eyes and smiled. because he knew living in Oymyakon wasn't just about enduring the cold. It was about learning to love one's own silence, and understanding that true resilience lives in those who don't run away. And there, without even realizing it, he became a kind of lighthouse, a living reminder that yes, there is life in the coldest place on earth, and that it beats stronger than anyone can imagine. That early morning, he woke up without knowing why. There was no noise, no light. The silence was so absolute, it seemed to carry a new weight, as if something were about to happen. He got up slowly, walked to the window, and there he realized the darkness was denser than usual, and the cold different, more aggressive, older. The central generator had failed. The village's power was compromised. He knew it without needing to confirm. It was as if his body had learned to recognize the absence of warmth even before his senses could. He dressed quickly, grabbed the flashlights, and went out. Outside, everything was too white, too dark, too silent. He walked to the station with steady steps, and with each step, he felt the weight of responsibility. Because there, keeping the heat on was more than a technical task. It was a thin line between life and danger. When he arrived, he found the door frozen shut. He had to use his whole body to force it open. Inside, the absence of the machineries was more frightening than any howling wind. The main generator was down. A mechanical error? A natural collapse? He didn't know yet. He worked for hours without stopping. His fingers ached inside the gloves. His forehead sweated even in sub-zero temperatures. His mind raced, searching for solutions, and his heart carried more than technical urgency. It carried the fear of letting down an entire village. Flashes from the past came to his memory. The first time his father took him to that same station, years ago. The firm voice, the detailed explanations, the quiet pride of someone who was part of something bigger. And the last sentence he heard before his father passed, "The cold doesn't forgive, son, but it doesn't lie either." He took a deep breath, replaced parts, made adjustments, restarted systems. And when everything seemed lost, a faint flicker in the emergency lights made him stop. The engine coughed, then roared. It was back. He bowed his head, exhausted but whole. Once again, he had defeated the impossible. When he stepped outside, he was greeted by a sky in transition. Still dark, but with signs of deep blue trying to break through. The village still slept, unaware of the crisis that almost froze it from within. And that, in a way, comforted him. Because some victories are better when silent. On the way back, he saw fresh footprints in the snow. Small, light, uneven. He paused for a moment, recognized the pattern. They were from the girl next door, who left every morning too early to feed. The dogs, that touched him. Because even children there understood the value of routine. Back home, he warmed a piece of bread on the stove and ate slowly. His body asked for rest, but his mind was alert. There was a new restlessness in his chest, something he couldn't name. A mix of pride and deep exhaustion. As if carrying the village on his shoulders was becoming lonelier each day. He remembered the woman he had loved years ago. She had left for the city, saying that living there was like freezing her own dreams. And he, though he felt the same pain, had stayed, because what was prison for her was mission for him. But sometimes he wondered if he had made the right choice. Her letters were still kept. He never replied to any. Not for lack of will, but for not knowing what to say. The time between them had frozen like the soil of Oymyakon. Too solid to dig. Too cold to heal. Later, he found the village boy sitting alone near the fishing trail. He approached slowly, respecting the silence. The boy looked at him and asked with pure eyes, "Why have you never left?" He smiled, didn't answer. Just sat beside him. Because there are questions that only time can answer. That afternoon, a piece of news spread. A snowstorm was approaching. Families began reinforcing windows, stocking food, checking their firewood. He went from house to house, helping, not out of obligation, but because he knew that's what people do there. They care for others, even in silence. In one house, he found the elderly woman quietly crying. He asked if everything was all right. She replied simply, "Today marks 5 years since my husband passed. He used to say I was strong, but I was only strong because he was here." He held her hand and stayed there. Said nothing. Sometimes, presence is worth more than any word. Back on the street, he felt the wind shift. The snowstorm would arrive in a few hours. The sky darkened quickly, as if it were descending over the village. There was still time to prepare the station. Reinforce the door, make sure nothing would fail. And he did all that, methodically, precisely, but inside. A different cold was growing. As he closed the tool shed, he heard a child's laughter in the distance. Someone playing in the snow. Before it turned into a storm, and that disarmed him. Because it's in the most extreme moments that joy insists on showing up. As if life wanted to remind, there's still something to protect. On the way back home, he stopped before the small sign at the village entrance. The name Amiakon carved into the worn metal. He touched it with his gloved fingers. There was his story, his prison, his freedom, all at once. And in that moment, he felt a lump in his throat. He hadn't cried in years. Didn't even know how anymore. But there, under that starless sky and the snow that refused to stop falling, the tears came. They weren't of sadness, nor pain. They were of acceptance. Because living in that place was also accepting that the heart beats stronger when it knows where it belongs. Upon entering his house, he removed his boots carefully. The heat from the stove filled the room. He grabbed a wooden mug, poured tea, and sat in his grandmother's armchair. He listened to the crackle of the burning firewood like someone listening to an old song. And there, between silence and breath, he understood that what kept him there wasn't courage, it was love. Love for the harsh land. Love for the quiet people. Love for the routine that doesn't need to prove anything to be real. And that kind of love can't be explained. Only lived. As the snowstorm approached, he felt steady. Prepared, not because he was stronger than the cold, but because he had learned to walk with it. And deep down he knew, every storm passes. But those who stay learn to recognize the value of their own story. He closed his eyes for a few minutes. Didn't sleep. Just let his body, the one that had done so much that day, rest. And inside him, something settled. A kind of rare peace, not made of certainty but of presence. And there, in the heart of the coldest place on earth, something warm was blooming. And maybe that's what few would understand from the outside. That there is more life where it seems there is none. That the cold, when respected, reveals the most authentic warmth. The night fell like a sheet of lead over Oymyakon. The sky had vanished. The wind didn't blow, it roared. It was as if all the fury of the Arctic had chosen that tiny village to collapse upon. And inside each house, watchful eyes stared at reinforced doors, hoping they wouldn't give in. He wasn't sleeping. He sat, coat still on, watching the flame of the stove flicker with each gust trying to seep through the cracks. The sound of the wind was different. It was no longer a warning, it was a challenge. And he knew what would come in the next few hours would define more than a season. It would define bonds, memories, destinies. A crack outside made him stand up. The tree next to his house had broken under the weight of the ice. It was a dry, painful sound. A reminder that even what is strong has a limit. And that struck him in a strange way. As if the tree were a metaphor for what he had been feeling in recent days. He put on his gloves, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped outside. The icy air cut like a knife. Visibility was minimal. The snow fell sideways, whipping everything that stood, but he kept going. He couldn't stay. He knew that on nights like that, things happen. And the worst part isn't what the cold does to the body, but what it does to time. The first house he reached was the elderly woman's. He knocked hard. When she answered, already wrapped in blankets, he simply said, "You're coming with me." She didn't argue, just grabbed a bag with medicine and followed. She knew that sometimes trusting was the only way to survive. They headed to his house. Along the way, others joined. Entire families, frightened children, dogs wrapped in blankets. In less than an hour, his house became a shelter, a point of light in the middle of a white blackout. And he silently became a beacon. There wasn't enough space for everyone to be comfortable, but there was fire. And more importantly, there was intention. The house filled with low voices, sighs, watchful eyes. No one spoke loudly, as if afraid of drawing the storm's attention. As if the cold could hear, he shared the food he had, made tea in rounds, gave up his room for the most fragile, and stayed in the living room, near the door, like a silent guardian. His eyes burned, his body begged for a break. But he knew, it was now that everything found meaning. Hours later, there was a knock on the door. It was the boy from the station. The main generator had failed again, and he needed help. He looked at the faces inside the house, all silent, all waiting for his decision. And without saying a word, he put on his coat and left once more. The path to the station was treacherous. The snow-covered trails erased references. He knew the terrain, but even the most familiar steps seemed dangerous that night. And there was something different in the air, an ancient urgency, almost spiritual. When he arrived, he saw the generator covered in ice. The gears had seized. He worked with bare hands for a few minutes, until the blood began to fade from his fingers. But he didn't stop. Each piece thawed was a life warmed. Each spark, a promise of dawn. The engine roared again. Weak, but alive. He fell to his knees not from weakness, but from release. He cried without knowing why. There was no longer a difference between sweat, tears, and snow. It was all one and the same. And there, on the station floor, something inside him disarmed. On the way back, he could barely walk. The wind pushed him backward. His muscles ached. The flashlight failed. But he kept going, not because he was a hero, but because he knew there were people inside that house waiting. People believing he would return. And that alone was enough. When he arrived, he was received with reverent silence. The look said everything. He just smiled and said, "It's going to be okay." Then, he sat on the floor, near the stove, and let the heat do what it could. For the first time, he slept right there, surrounded by strangers who that night were more family than any other bond. The storm lasted 2 days. And in those 2 days, the house became school, chapel, hospital, and home. Everyone helped as they could. Someone cooked. Another told stories. The children drew with charcoal on the walls. It was as if the cold had forced the birth of a new village within the old one. On the second night, the elderly woman took his hand and said, "Your father would be proud." He simply closed his eyes, because it was true. And because he had never heard that said out loud. It was as if that compliment had been saved for years, waiting for the right moment to be born. On the third day, the sky cleared, the wind stopped, and the whiteness of the landscape seemed less hostile. People went out little by little. They gave thanks with touches, glances, quick hugs. There were no speeches. But there was a deep, ancestral recognition. Alone again, he looked at the empty room. The marks on the floor, the blankets scattered, the mugs still with cold tea. Every detail was a memory. And he knew there that something inside him had changed. He was no longer just a resident of Oymyakon. He was part of the place's soul. Outside, the village reorganized, the children played. The neighbors greeted each other with more warmth. And he, for the first time in years, felt that the cold had retreated, not outside, but inside him. And that's how life goes on in the coldest place in the world, not because the weather changes, but because the heart learns to warm what the world insists on freezing. When everything returned to normal, what surprised him the most was the sound. Not the silence of the storm, but the sound of simple things. The clinking of spoons and mugs, the sound of snow being shoveled from sidewalks, the slow steps of those starting over. It was as if the world had come back to life slowly, with respect for everything that had been suspended. He woke up to the sound of calm wind. The same house, the same stove. But what was inside him was no longer the same. He looked around and saw that every detail, once routine, now carried a different weight. The chair where the elderly woman had sat. The wall where the child had drawn with charcoal. The window that served as shelter for so many anxious eyes. People returned to their homes, but they left traces. Small thank you notes, a piece of bread in a napkin, a carefully folded blanket. He kept everything. Not out of attachment, but because he understood that some memories need concrete proof. The village breathed like someone coming up from a deep dive. The children laughed louder. The adults greeted each other with one more second of eye contact. It was as if everyone had discovered, at the same time, what it really means to live together in a place where the world almost never arrives. He returned to the station. The generator was working fine. But now, every mechanical noise sounded like music. It was strange to realize that the machine that had demanded so much from him was also what gave rhythm to the village. It was heart and threat. It was reason and mission. In the following days, he returned to his routine. Cutting firewood, helping neighbors, keeping the fire lit. But now, each gesture carried an invisible layer. He was no longer just the man who endured the cold. He was the one who welcomed others in the midst of it. And that changed everything. He began to notice things he hadn't seen before. The way the boy passed by with his sled. The way the girl from the store quietly hummed while packing items. The eyes of the neighbor who once so closed off, now carried a discreet tenderness. It was as if the cold had broken everyone's defenses. To build something more genuine, he started writing more in his notebook. Small phrases, perceptions, memories that once seemed ordinary and now had a different glow. As if finally he had found meaning not in the big turning points, but in what remains after everything passes. He would sit at the doorstep in the late afternoon, tea in hand. The sky in Oymyakon was a silent spectacle. Shades of blue, white, and orange mixing without demanding attention. And he, there, simply watched, without needing to name, without needing to prove anything. Just feeling. He received a letter from the city. It was from the woman who had left years ago. She had heard about the snowstorm in the news and asked if he was okay. The words were few, but heavy. He read it, smiled with moist eyes and didn't respond. Because he understood that some distances are bridges only inward. One weekend, the village organized a communal dinner, the first in years. Everyone brought what they had. Bread, dried fish, rare fruits. Laughter emerged. Stories were shared. And he, who always spoke little, listened to everything with the attention of someone who knows the world is stitched together in those details. That night, a boy approached him and asked, "Will you ever leave?" He looked into the boy's eyes, took a deep breath and said, "I don't know. But while I'm here, I'll take care of it." And the boy smiled like someone who understands that a promise made with truth, even without certainty, is already enough. It started snowing again. But now he didn't feel the cold the same way. It was as if his body had been shaped by something deeper than resistance, belonging, because it was no longer him against the cold. It was him with the cold. As if they had made peace, he looked at the old radio on the shelf. It was on, playing a song he hadn't heard in a long time. It was the same one that played when his father first took him to the station, that broke him inside. Not because of the song itself, but because he realized he had completed his cycle. He crossed the village to the cemetery, in silence. He carried flowers made of cloth. His father's grave was covered in snow. But he knew exactly where to step. He placed the flowers, stood still, and said only, "It worked." And then, for the first time in a long while, he smiled softly. On the way back, he felt the ground firm beneath his feet. Not because the winter was lighter, but because he was stronger. Not with the strength of someone who fights, but of someone who accepts. Because true power lies in not hardening on the inside, even when everything freezes on the outside. Upon entering his house, he closed the door slowly, lit the fire, sat at the table, opened the notebook, and wrote, "Oymyakan taught me that living is not about resisting. It's about allowing. It's about opening space inside your chest so that cold and warmth can coexist without one canceling the other." And that's what many don't understand when they look at maps and documentaries, that the coldest place on Earth is not measured only in degrees. It's measured in silences, in gestures, in glances that say, "I'm still here." If you've made it this far, maybe you've felt that cold. And maybe you've realized that it also exists inside each of us, whenever we feel isolated, small, forgotten. But the secret is not in running from it. It's in warming someone else with your presence. And that's why stories like this matter. Because they remind us that even at the end of the world, life pulses, life insists. Life lights up. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. Here, every week, you discover what life is like, even in the places where it seems impossible. Because life, it always finds a way, even when everything seems frozen.